so excited to welcome you to part 3 of our series, A Force to be Reckoned with, Women in Vermont's Food System. This week's topic is grassroots organizing as a form of local resiliency. This series has been created by Shift Meals in response to COVID-19, specifically how this pandemic and economic crisis have revealed the impacts of long-standing systems of inequity. We are so grateful for our collaborators and supporters who are helping to make room for these important conversations. In particular today, I want to acknowledge City Market, the Skinny Pancake, High Meadows Fund, the Restaurant Workers Community Foundation, the Vermont Farm to Plate Network, and you for making time to listen, learn, and support. To get us started, I invite each of our speakers to share their name and pronouns, organization, so we can see who's in the room with us today. Carolina, you want to start?
Sure. My name is Carolina Lukac. I go by she, her. I am the garden education manager for a local nonprofit called the Vermont Community Garden Network.
Alisha?
Hey, I'm Alisha Laramee, and I go by she, her, and I work for AALV, a local in Burlington nonprofit that works with refugees and immigrants, and I oversee the New Farms for New Americans Refugee Agriculture Program.
Thank you. Emma?
Hi, I am Emma Schoenberg. My pronouns are she and her, and I am part of a group here in Burlington, Vermont called Food Not Bombs.
Thank you. Liv?
Hey everyone, my name is Liv Pena. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the founder of the Vermont Releaf Collective. Releaf stands for Racial Equity in Land, Environment, Agriculture, and Food Systems.
Amazing. Kat?
My name is Kat Buxton. I go by she, her. And I run a business called Grow More, Waste Less, teaching people how to do just that and learning from them. And I work with a bunch of organizations, Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition, the Grassroots Center for Organizing, Rural Vermont, NOFA, lots.
Thank you. Sarah Jean?
Hey everybody, my name is Sara Jean Whelan. A lot of people also call me SJ, which is fine too. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the board chair of Slow Food Vermont.
Thank you. And my lovely co-host and co-creator today, Zamora.
Hi everyone, my name is Zamora. I use she, her pronouns, and I am Shift Meals, or one of Shift Meals BIPOC Food Sovereignty Program Managers.
And again, I am Sammy. I am the Grow Team Manager for Shift Meals, and I use she, her pronouns. And I am in a moment going to offer some context that I had planned for today's conversation, but first I'm just going to invite Zamora to speak and reflect on some current events, some things that are happening today, because it's really important to remember that this is a dynamic world and things are changing and news is happening every day. So Zamora, the floor is yours.
I thought it was important for us to kind of just take a second and recognize the massive injustice that has just occurred in our country and that continues to occur to Black women and femmes in particular. We just got the court ruling regarding Breonna Taylor's case, the murder of Breonna Taylor, and no justice was served, which was not news that surprised me by any means, but it's difficult for me to honor and recognize the voices and experiences of women and femmes without first and foremost recognizing the treatment and indifference and disdain of Black women and femmes as a Black woman and femme. So I just wanted to honor her today in this space, remember her name, remember her story, to say her name out loud, and to recognize that she and others alike kind of paved the way for conversations like these and provide context for the importance of these conversations and the importance of specifically centering Black women and femmes at the core of movement work. And so I just wanted to give a moment of silence for her and for her family and for Black women and femmes everywhere that continue to suffer at the hands of white supremacy and institutionalized racism. So yeah, I just wanted to, let's take a moment to just recognize that and to let that sink in. Ready.
Thank you, Zamora. I think we can stop sharing this screen too when we have a moment. Yeah, thank you again so much for bringing that up. It would be pretty wild to have a conversation talking about organizing in order to affect change without realizing that this is an experience that we're all living, and these organizations and these movements, it means something. It's not just a conversation. It's not just theory. This is so real for everybody. So some important context today, and I'll speak just a bit more about what we're going to talk about today. So we are halfway through our series now that's highlighting some incredible women and femme workers throughout the Vermont food system. For those of you that are just joining for the first time this week, I really welcome you into this conversation. I'm so happy you're here. And for those that have been following along, I hope you'll agree with me when I say how interesting it's been to see that even though, we're talking about different topics every week, there's these larger themes that are starting to reappear and guide the series as a whole. We've talked about COVID-19 and its effect on our food system. We've talked about the femme experience of working within it. And what I keep hearing is this need for a really radical shift in values and policies that are going to allow for a more collective future. And it's been really inspiring to envision a future where our communities are more resilient, where they're safer, and they're communities where the needs of all people in them are being met. And so when I'm thinking about this vision, how do we get here? And so it's so appropriate that today's conversation is about grassroots organizing, because this is exactly where different types of organizing comes in. The definition of a grassroots movement is one which uses the people in a given district, region, or community as the basis for a political or economic movement. Grassroots movements and organizations use collective action from the local level to affect change. So basically, my interpretation of this is a grassroots movement allows me to empower myself versus being told what's going to make my life better. And grassroots movements, in their purest form, are effective tools in dismantling broken systems. If our goals are to deepen democracy and create new and equitable systems, these must be systems where the most historically marginalized groups are part of the decision-making process about what needs to change and how to enact these changes. As movements become organizations and organizations become institutions, we see a vast spectrum of how groups identify with this word grassroots. All of our speakers today do such different work within the food system, and not all of them would identify themselves or their organizations as grassroots. But what they do all have in common is a dedication to using their power and organizational resources to give voice to underrepresented communities and provide support in creating a just food system in Vermont. This topic is really complex, especially in regards to these social, food, and racial justice movements happening amidst a global pandemic. As I have discussions in my life around the power of grassroots movements, a few of the things that I come up against are how and when do I show up for these movements, and acknowledging that that question of how and when to show up comes from a place of privilege. Where do those who hold power need to provide structure for marginalized communities? And is that an inherently anti-grassroots idea? And then also, how does mutual aid, which has been so inspiring for me to see showing up to support frontline communities, scale up to larger community systems? So just the little questions that keep me up at night, ready to hear any answers. And this is just one lens to think about these questions through. Today's panelists are leaders in community-based solutions. They're organizers, they're volunteers, they're program managers who are strengthening our community's ability to address and repair systemic inequities, rising food insecurity, and other vulnerabilities that have been exacerbated by COVID-19. I am so excited to hear what they have to say. I just want to take one more quick moment to honor the language that we're using in this series. The language we have chosen is intended to honor the unique and variable experiences of our panelists. To honor the non-binary experience of gender, we have chosen to use women spelled with an X and femmes. And to clarify, I'm going to offer the following definitions. Women with an X is an all-encompassing way to describe women without being associated or defined by our proximity or relationship to men. It's a more inclusive way of bringing non-cis women and specifically trans women into the conversation and community. Femme, anyone regardless of their gender identity or sex can identify as femme. This is all about the way a person chooses to express their gender or sexuality, and which typically, but definitely not always, tends to be on the more feminine side of the spectrum of femininity, neutrality, and masculinity. Therefore, anyone from gay men, cishet women, lesbian, queer, trans women, non-binary folks, and anyone can identify as femme. We believe it's really important to use gender-neutral and more inclusive language whenever possible, especially when discussing and amplifying the most marginalized voices among us. And whether it's language or broader concepts, when we shift our focus away from the status quo, we put ourselves in a mind space that is more open to exploring new ideas. As we hear these women and femme leaders discuss grassroots organizing, I invite you all to join us in visioning beyond that which we are used to in order to reimagine an equitable future full of thriving, safe, and resilient communities. I'm almost done talking. I'm now going to invite everyone in to this dynamic and a really much too short hour that we have together. There's going to be a Q&A at the end. So audience, there's a Q&A box at the bottom. Feel free to send in questions as they come up. Zamora is going to be managing that box, and we will get to as many as we can. And I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists a hot seat question, just so we can hear everybody's voice for a moment. We're going to try to keep these answers to 3 or so minutes. I'll give you a reminder if the time is slipping away. I'm going to start with Carolina. Carolina, the collective model of gardening that you teach embodies a much more grassroots approach to organizing a garden space than a traditional farm. I'd love to hear about how you developed this vision and what you think about its ability to be scaled to embrace different farm businesses and different size gardens.
Yes, happy to talk about it. This whole idea and model for a collective shared growing space has been in so many conversations that I've had with many different people in different spheres. For me, I'm a garden educator. I teach folks how to grow their own food on a garden scale. And for the past 5 years, I've been doing that through the Vermont Community Garden Network at one of their teaching gardens, where students who sign up for the 6-month-long class get their own garden bed, and they tend to it, they water it, they harvest from it, and I'm the garden mentor who guides folks to know what to plant in early June, identify pests, support them with pest management. And it's very much an each to your own, in your own little space, but we're gardening together as a class, and we meet throughout those 6 months. A few years ago, 3 years ago, after a full season's class, those students wanted more. They really appreciated the experience. They weren't ready to garden on their own. Many of them did not have land to then take these skills and garden in their backyard or purchase land. And they wanted to do it together. So they asked me to come up with what is an advanced class going to look like. And that's when I proposed, instead of each to their own, what happens if the 12 of us come together and we use the same space that we used last year, but we collectively decide what we're going to grow and where we're going to grow it. And we work together in small crews to figure out who's on watering, who's on pest management, who is harvesting this week. And so we did that second year, and it was an exponentially different experience in terms of how much we produced. It was very visual for me to see when you do your own growing of food and you have so many plants together in 80 square feet that you're given as a student, and you're growing a diverse amount of vegetables. It's hard to manage them. It's a different way of managing, as opposed to having a whole bed for cabbage that you can row cover and you can protect from pests easier. And there was also students who wanted tomatillos, and one tomatillo plant probably produces more tomatillos than you want for your own salsa. So what happens if we share those plants and share that harvest? So there was a deep contrast in how much we were able to produce. The community weaving, like the web of folks that second year, there was a definite different feeling to it. If somebody traveled, if somebody was sick, if somebody needed to bring their child to class, that was fine. You could be gone for 2 weeks and you could come back and jump right in because we got your back. We watered for you. And there was also the understanding that when you're not there, you don't take home a harvest. There was an accountability on, we didn't keep track of who came, who didn't. Did you work for 4 hours? Did you work for 6 hours? If you showed up to our Wednesday evenings, then whatever was harvested and put on the table, you could take home what you felt you would consume. And if there was leftover, you'd take home for your neighbor. And if there was still leftover, we'd figure out where can we donate this produce. This outdoor classroom that I'm speaking of is within a community garden setting. And so it's a very different contrast to how the traditional community garden works, where everybody does their own. There may be a shared tool shed, so there's some shared resources. But in terms of how we organize as a community interested in learning these lifelong skills of gardening and how much can we grow in limited space that we have living within an urban environment, it was mind-blowing to me. And this season, we had the opportunity to do a second trial of what does it look like to grow food in community. The Victory Garden that we ran at the same location as these other experiences I'm mentioning was one of Shift Meal's COVID response initiatives. People who most of them had never gardened before, came and participated again in this collective model. You come, you volunteer for 2 hours, and you take home so much more food than you can if you were gardening on your own. So it's an evolving model. There's so much still to learn and so much still to create. I think there's so much potential for where this can go. How can we scale it up? How can we include different people? How can we replicate this in different parts of our city, our state, our nation? Yeah.
Thank you. I love, it feels like such a tangible metaphor about organizing for me, these individual garden plots versus this collective plot. And so, yeah, it always helps me really understand what we're talking about when in these larger conversations. So thanks for sharing that with everybody. Alisha, I'd love to go to you next. So New Farms for New Americans provides land access and resources for the growing population of refugees and immigrant communities in Vermont, and thus the ability to grow their own food and culturally significant crops from their homes. Why is gardening, and specifically growing recognizable crops, so important in supporting these new communities in Vermont? And how can our local food system be more supportive or welcoming to the communities that you serve?
Thanks for having me. So just to give a little context to New Farms for New Americans, I work with I should say, like a larger team of people, in the sense that NFNA is part of AALV, which is this refugee and immigrant organization nonprofit. And most of the people I work with are from the various countries that the people that are farming are from. So we have a really diverse staff and multicultural staff, multilingual staff, and that really helps me to be able to do the work that I'm doing, just to support the farmers that are at the farm. And to give a sense of it, we have about 7 acres at down between the Winooski Valley Park District in Burlington and the Intervale Center, and we work with about 65 families, and that kind of serves about 300 people. So between the families who are eating from the food that they produce, and then the neighbors that people share the food with, and others, where it's probably about 300 people who are receiving food from this farm. The NFNA kind of has had an evolving history in itself, in terms of it being a program that is often grant funded, and the grant funding has required or asked different things of the program over the years, but we've been able to shift the model of the farm so that it actually has been every year responding more and more and more to the needs of the farmers that are there. And a big push was actually to have the farm shift from this model where we were collectively farming to sell the produce, to actually farming by families. So kind of in the reverse of what Carolina is talking about a little bit, in that we were collectively selling the produce, and then the families were saying, okay, that's great, we're making a little extra money during the summer, but we'd really love to just be able to grow the food that's important to us, to our cultures, and to take that food home to our families instead of selling it to other people. And so that's what we've been able to do. And the plots are significantly larger than you would find in an urban garden, one of the community gardens in Burlington or Winooski. And that's in direct that they want more land, because a lot of the farmers that I work with come from agrarian backgrounds, and they were subsistence farmers before they came. So this is just who they are. This is a part of their blood, their life. This is what they know. And so that's what we've done. We've provided larger plots of land for them. And I mean, I think anyone who farms or gardens understands what it means to be connected to the soil, and what it means to feel spring and know how excited you are when it's just about time to, start planting. And that's what the farmers that I work with, they talk about going to the farm and feeling like they're home. And that idea of home has such a different context when you've lived the life of a refugee and you've been forced from your home, and been forced to leave all of the land, the crops, the animals, everything that you knew. So the sense of belonging to Vermont and Vermont's food system, just by being able to work the land and work the soil, I think is part of what makes the farm mean so much to people. And every day we're trying to expand how people can be involved in the food system at large. And that's sort of an ongoing conversation, and part of our next phase of work, of getting people more involved outside of the farm itself. So, but that's another conversation maybe for later.
Thank you so much. I love that, like, kind of a totally opposite idea of what was just said, was the right solution for this community, and just shows how flexible and how different solutions are for different folks. So thank you. Emma, I'm going to come to you next. So Food Not Bombs truly has not missed a step in supporting its community since this COVID pandemic has started, from handing out meals daily and now to supporting the protest encampment at Battery Park in Burlington. Love for you to touch briefly about Food Not Bomb's history supplying food to protests and to protests and occupations, and then also if you would speak about how food justice ties so deeply into the social movements we're in the midst of today.
Thanks. God, what a question. Food Not Bombs is a 40-year-old organization that started in Cambridge, Mass, in the really early 80s. And it started out actually with the founder being arrested for serving food at a protest and refusing to stop do that. And so many ways, like the DNA of Food Not Bombs includes a component of political protest and direct action, simply by serving food to anybody who wants it in places that people wouldn't expect to find food, or especially free food. And in Burlington, we've kind of sought out to see if there are other chapters that have existed here over the last 40 years. We know there's one in the 80s. There's one in the 90s that protested McDonald's being built where the farmhouse is now. A lot of the historical DNA of Food Not Bombs was around veganism and vegetarianism, but also anti-militarism. And so here in Burlington and all the chapters that I've met across the country, these two primary goals of food justice and political education, feeding people and also going deep about why people are being unfed in the first place, has been kind of at the core of the effort. And since the pandemic started, we've had, I did a quick little look, and I think we've had maybe 200 to 300 folks participate on a volunteer level. No one's paid for Food Not Bombs. And because of people offering support and food and donations, and gosh, that number doesn't even encapsulate donations, we've been able to build a mutual aid network that can withstand a lot and kind of touch that food justice principle of resiliency. And so that's still kind of the work that we're doing, and showing up for protests, feeding food there has been, historically something that we've done as well. And I just want to mention the Battery Park encampment has had a huge swelling of mutual aid just around that one action. And so while we've been playing slightly a coordinator role and providing some ingredients for people who are cooking in their own homes to bring to the park, we're definitely not responsible for that, and just want to share that so many people have put work into that. That question about food justice movements, and please stop me with time because I didn't look at the clock when I started.
You have another minute or so.
Yeah, well, I think that it touches upon two levels of change making that we're trying to hit upon, one of which is very accessible to grassroots movements, and it's what social change theorists might call constructive program or community uplift, that as the new world approaches, we're going to figure out how to feed one another and take care of our sick and take care of the elderly. These are these constructive pieces of society that need to be shifting away from oppressive systems. And then on a secondary level, there's a spiritual connection, an embodied connection to food sharing. I know that human beings have been food sharing for as long as there's been human beings upon this planet. And so it's deeply integral to how we connect as communities. One thing that I love about food justice, and particularly the role that Food Not Bombs plays, is it just brings more choice to what people have access to. In the early days of the pandemic, we got a lot of questions if we were being redundant to other nonprofit organizations, or what you might call the grass tops. And I actually love this kind of sense of radical redundancy there, that it is equal value to provide somebody choice in the food that they have access to as it is just to provide food access, because choice is kind of the building ground of liberation and what is taken away under oppression. And so in that way, I think there's a deeper connection of autonomy inside of the food justice movement, more than just providing a meal for somebody. And in that way, we're building relationships that can transform and educate and build a stronger and more resilient community.
Yeah, a lot of what's come up in some of our previous conversations is this, yes, this like shift of like charity and how that's dependent on the giver versus like it should be dependent on the receiver, and this like agency and choice. That's such a, like, you know, it shouldn't be so far off. Like that feels so natural, and like just the way that food sharing should be. So thanks for bringing that up. I love that. And I'm sure we'll get back into that later. Liv, so your experiences working within Vermont's food system led you to create the Vermont Relief Collective that you shared about briefly, a coalition of BIPOC Vermonters working within our food system. And I have the old question pulled up. I'd love to hear your thought about like why this is such an important space to create, and how you see a space like this changing the scope of agriculture in Vermont.
Yeah, thanks, Sammy, for that question. So Releaf is a member-based organization created by and for BIPOC folks involved in the 4 focus areas, which are land, environment, agriculture, and food systems in Vermont. And so involvement could look a variety of ways. It might be work, pleasure, study, any combination of the above. So I'm going to be using the term BIPOC, which for folks who are unfamiliar means Black, Indigenous people of color. So Releaf was created as a space for members to connect, to amplify our collective voices, and to advocate for more equitable spaces in the environmental and agricultural sectors, and broadly the food system in Vermont. So as many folks have probably experienced this year, it can be, this year has been pretty isolating during these socially distanced times. And so even outside of the pandemic, being BIPOC people in Vermont can be incredibly isolating and sometimes exhausting, especially in doing work in the 4 focus areas. So even more so, you know, when in predominantly white or all white spaces, which is, you know, pretty accurate of many food systems and environmental and agricultural spaces in Vermont. Even though sometimes these spaces, you know, are like super well-intentioned and well-meaning, it could be quite, there can be harmful experiences that BIPOC folks experience. And so I recently learned about this concept called racial battle fatigue, which I think really well encapsulates the experiences that many of us have, you know, just trying to make it through in very white spaces as people of color, and just the exhaustion that comes from that. Releaf has a lot of different areas of how we're transforming the Vermont food system. The first and foremost is creating a space for BIPOC folks to connect from all around the state, because we are statewide, network, skill share, and just offer support and community for each other. So it's been really, really exciting and incredible to see all of the relationships and connections that are coming about as we continue to organize this space. And, you know, we really focus on making our spaces fully BIPOC centered. So in particular, I'm excited for the winter and, you know, having BIPOC cross-country ski trips and events, you know, in safe ways and following COVID guidelines, but looking forward to those spaces of, you know, being in community while being outside. We're also transforming the food system by amplifying our presence. So when folks are thinking about the Vermont food system, Vermont farmers, Vermont cheesemakers, I have a feeling that they're probably not imagining the folks who are Releaf members. And so by having this community and amplifying our presence and our stories and our experiences, we're changing the narrative of who's involved in food and farming. And so as we do that, it's really important that we're not, you know, as one entity, one collective, we're not here to tell folks' stories. We're just here to pass the mic. And then finally, we're advocating for our community. So recently I heard a phrase, nothing about us without us. And so I think it's really important that our community has a platform to speak for ourselves, so that we can focus on truly voicing our hopes and our needs. And, you know, what we see is a path forward to creating a more equitable food system, equitable agriculture and environmental sector in Vermont. So it's been really exciting to watch and participate in the development of this really revolutionary space.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been so amazing. It is revolutionary. I've loved like seeing you create this and watch this grow, and it's such an important space. So thanks for putting in the work there. Kat, we're going to switch over to you now. So throughout your career, you have successfully used grassroots campaign to affect lasting policy change. I think a lot of people are familiar with the Right to Know Coalition, which led to the GMO labeling law that got passed in 2014. And so I'd love to hear you touch on different grassroots strategies and which ones are the most successful in actually affecting long-lasting legislative change. And also if there's any, you know, current movements or campaigns that you're stoked about, we'd love to hear.
Okay, so I think we can and have made some changes through the legislature, and I think that's an important tool in the toolbox. But I think the most effective change is cultural, and working with schools and children and communities, and what I see a lot of the women on this screen doing. That's how we actually affect change. Working with the legislature within the confines of a white supremacist system built on appropriated technologies is really confining. So if we can help to strengthen our social mycelium and get the knowledge into the hands of legislators who, by and large, with some exceptions in Vermont, don't contact soil and don't grow food, I think we can make more changes that way. Traditionally, Vermont's legislature has had a pretty strong farming and agricultural background, but it's really dairy and it's really white supremacist, and it's failing pretty significantly. So it's time to change that, and everyone here is a big part of that solution. So I love to work with children. I grow school gardens and I teach kids about soil science and bugs and plants and composting and connecting with ecosystems. And in doing that, I'm able to also work with teachers and parents and administrators. And I'm interested in working more on supervisory union levels. So yes, the legislature can be helpful, and in my work with Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition and Rural Vermont, I do quite a bit of legislative advocacy work with coalitions. I'm most interested in working in coalition and in collaboration from a grassroots standpoint. That's really the only way that we're going to affect change, is to live it and grow it.
Thank you so much. That point about like working within the system of legislation being so confining is something Samora and I were discussing this morning and talking about this conversation, and like what it means to make change within a system versus making a new system, and that battle of like, oh, it seems so hard, you know, that battle that I come into tension a lot. Yeah.
A spark that I'd just like to leave in the context of that question is, how can we ask better questions? Not you in particular, but if we go to the legislature, how do we do that and ask better questions? because if we ask a question that gives us the wrong answer, we get more of the same. So when we're asking questions within the confines of our white supremacist and capitalist system, we're going to get answers that just promote that system. So how do we ask those better questions?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Sara Jean, we got to you. So I'd love to hear a little bit about Slow Food and how Slow Food Vermont operates within this like larger context of Slow Food International and the Slow Food USA organizations, and the benefits and challenges that come from being one chapter of Slow Food when it comes to creating a mission really specific to the community that you're serving here in Vermont.
I'd be happy to talk about that. Thanks. So just a brief overview of Slow Food for folks who might not be familiar. It's one of the largest food movements in the world. Started in Italy in 1989 when they tried to open a McDonald's on the base of the Spanish Steps in Rome. And Carlo Petrini and his communist friends went out with big bowls of penne pasta and protested the opening of this McDonald's. And since then, manifestos were signed, and the movement has spread to now be in over 160 different countries around the world. Slow Food at its core is a movement to unite people across the spectrum of the food system over the concept of good, clean, and fair food for all. And so what does that mean? Good means, the food is of high quality, it's culturally appropriate, and honors flavor and the beauty and dynamics of flavor. Clean means that the food was grown with integrity for the land, and our environment was, regenerated in the process rather than harmed. And fair, of course, means that it's fair for the people, that the people growing the food have sovereignty over what they're growing and are paid an equitable wage. And moreover, that the people who are trying to access that food are able to choose what they're eating and pay fair prices for it. And so Slow Food truly is a grassroots movement. And I think I do really appreciate this question of like the dynamics of having this very large international movement, but then also implementing it in the local community. And I think that there are both benefits and challenges to it. On the one hand, it can be challenging in some aspects to like sort of work under this larger umbrella. And I think that Slow Food as an organization, like I'll call it out, it has a lot of work to do with dismantling this, white elitist super food club that it has gained that reputation of over the years. And very specifically, since the passing of the Equity, Inclusion, and Justice Manifesto from Slow Food USA in 2017, we've been really calling ourselves out as an organization and doing the good work of trying to raise up the voices of people who have been systematically oppressed and like truly make it, good, clean, and fair food for all. And so in that sense, it can be sort of struggling on the local level of knowing how to embrace slow food, since the organization does have its faults. But that being said, there's a lot of opportunity to organize in a way that feels meaningful for our own communities, and we are able to, receive support and guidance from both the national and global offices. There's a plethora of different campaigns and events that are promoted on that global and national level that are very adaptable to local communities. And I can talk about that more as we continue, but there's also a lot of ability to just create your own thing and still, it's still slow food. So in that sense, there's a real beauty in the movement and whatever good, clean, and fair food looks like for your community, you can embrace that, and you'll have a cute little snail as your logo.
Thank you for answering that and for being like vulnerable in the ability to like recognize where issues come up and like recognize that need for, you know, the work to be done. So I appreciate that. And thank you, everybody. It's so amazing to hear all your first answers. I'm wondering if anyone wants to respond briefly to anything that has been said already, because so many amazing ideas have come up. And if not, I can ask some more questions. Oh, go ahead, Liv.
Yeah, I would just say that I really like Kat's question. And I think that's something that I'm going to be chewing on for a while. So thanks, Kat.
I just want to say that I can't wait to work more with all of you. We need each other. This is exciting.
I love that. Yeah. What are the right questions? I don't know. I think that is something we maybe can get to today. I'd love to, you know, pose this to the group and see if anyone wants to go for it. What can individuals and institutions who maybe hold more power and privilege do to support grassroots efforts to empower marginalized communities? If anyone wants to. Yeah, go ahead.
Because I actually was similarly having a conversation about this just the other day. I mean, listening, it sounds so simple, and listening with the kind of accountability attached to it that the feedback will be followed up on. I mean, okay, like Food Not Bombs, yes, I'll say the word, is an anarchist organization. So like the typical answer might be like, you know, dismantle yourselves if you have more social power. But in this point, like building connections and building relationships and like having conversations and then following up on those, because that's the tension of like, we're not in the world as we want it right now, and we're in the world as it is. And with that, people that hold positions of power can work to do that dismantling in many different ways, whether that looks like coming to a Food Not Bombs distribution program, listening to the voices of the community that we heard, ensuring that things are bottom up and that the voices of the most impacted are there. And I can hear that like when Sara's talking about slow food, connecting the grassroots, and I'll say that term again, like the grass tops. Nonprofits have access to so many resources. They have access to money and to grants, and in the end become indebted into that cycle of grant funding. And I think probably all of us have struggled with that in our careers and in our lives. But at this point, that's a place where we can really start thinking about how to shift that access to the people that wouldn't normally have that kind of access. And so building pathways for that through listening, through conversations and building relationships seems like this first place that we can start. And then we'll, you know, completely transform it eventually.
Kat, I see you raising your hand there.
Yeah, right on, Emma. Listening was the very first word that popped into my head too, and the kind of listening that's very deep. I've been using an analogy for myself. If I'm an onion, I'm unpeeling my layers to get to the core, to where the growth happens. And I think that's something that we can all do individually, and certainly in any organizations, however anarchist, how do you say that? or traditional, to do that same thing. I tend to find myself working with non-traditional organizations, and every single one of them is going through really important, deep listening and growing periods right now. And more of the relationship building that Emma talked about as well. You know, I like to use the term the social mycelium because I'm a soil geek and I like to put everything back to the soil. And so how can we be more like that incredibly intelligent, collaborative network of organisms that holds not only our landscapes, but our communities together?
Yeah, I'm wondering if either Carolina or Alisha, as you know, coming from these like nonprofit backgrounds and organizations, like what's coming up for you, or you know, the work that both of your organizations are doing are so clearly like tangibly supporting our community. And so I'm just wondering if anything's coming up for you in this conversation. Alisha, go ahead.
So I've been thinking about, in response to the listening, my New Year's motto this year was, or what I said to myself was, seek first to understand before being understood. And so that's posted on the wall in my kitchen, and that's what I read every day. And I think to take that into my work life, it's not how can I get the farmers that I work with, that I serve, to get involved in Vermont's food system, but in many ways the reverse of how can I get Vermont's food system involved in their lives and in what's meaningful to them, and where do we find those connections. And you know, visiting the farm, that's one way, yes, but and it's hard, it's complicated, it's not an easy process for anyone, and especially when I work with, down at the farm we have 7 different spoken languages, so even myself, I can't always communicate in English. I can try my best at other languages, and I do, but you know, but food is sort of that common language, and it's very easy in some ways to also just connect with people for food. But I'm going off on a tangent there. But anyway, I just, you know, I've been having a lot of conversations lately about, because of how important the BIPOC movement and conversations have become in Vermont recently, even though, you know, it's always been there. It's now much more on people's radar, and so people are wanting to connect with New Farms for New Americans, and it's wonderful. But also just not necessarily what I said before, not necessarily having farmers go into those spaces, but the reverse. And how do we start those conversations quite literally on the farm, in the spaces where the farmers are most comfortable being themselves and showcasing their lives and their connection to Vermont as Vermonters now.
Thank you.
I'll echo by saying that I think for me, this collective gardening experience, especially now during the pandemic, what it's created is, yes, food, we go home with food, we eat, but it's created a space for people in a time when we don't get to see each other anymore. And I think it's, for me, the whole community garden movement that I work in is, it's almost like the garden is the excuse to bring people together. And there's spaces that we strive to be inclusive and welcoming to folks. And when it doesn't feel like that, we need to hear that, and we want it to be like that. And just the comfort, the therapy that comes from being in a garden is something that we've all needed to recharge and to have the energy to fight all these battles and to continue the work that we do. So I think I appreciate what Alisha was saying on what kind of space does a farm, does a garden create? How can we have more of these conversations there? How can we bring everyone together in these kind of spaces to have conversation and be nourished by the land and give back to that land?
Yeah, I agree, like creating these spaces. And I think all of you in your work are creating different sorts of spaces where folks can be in community. And Liv, I know you have to jump off right at 1. I'm hoping maybe everyone can stay on a few extra minutes if they have the time, but I want to give you, your last few minutes here if there's anything you want to share about or respond to so far.
Yeah, I think just in the context of the question that you had asked, Sammy, and kind of in response or building off of the questions about, or the statements about listening, I also think it's important to keep in mind passing the mic. And I think it's really important that there's a variety of voices that are being heard in different situations at, on different platforms, on different stages, whatever it is. So I think a really important part of organizing is definitely making sure that it's a wide variety of voices that are being heard, and I will note, in non-tokenizing ways. But, there's a little bit of some work to do to make sure that the voices that are being amplified are being done so equitably.
I actually have a question. Can I ask a question, Sammy?
Of course.
Okay, awesome. So I had a question for Alisha. I don't know if this is a question that you can specifically answer, but it's more in terms of like New Farms for New Americans. Does New Farms for New Americans make any efforts to reconnect specifically African Americans to farming and agriculture, meaning descendants of chattel slavery? Like, the reason why I ask this is because African Americans also have a long history of being torn from the land and having little to no access to food and agriculture, even though we built the modern day agricultural system in the United States. And as of now, I would say that the term refugee doesn't actually encompass African Americans, but I would argue that it should, because I consider my grandparents who fled Jim Crow refugees that had to move up north to flee racial persecution and to seek jobs as refugees that were also descendants of sharecroppers and enslaved peoples who worked the land for free for hundreds of years. And so I'm interested in, is there any talk or discussion or around what can we do to specifically bring African Americans, descendants of chattel slavery, onto the farm in an equitable way where they feel seen and heard and can kind of tap back into this ancestral knowledge and grow food, and to grow our traditional ancestral foods. Because for example, I love cooking collard greens, but it's very hard to find things like collard greens and okra and just different traditional foods in Vermont, at Vermont farmers markets and abroad. And so I think that many African Americans specifically would have a strong interest in being able to access those traditional cultural foods, and also reconnecting with farming in a way that doesn't feel exploitative.
Thanks for your question. So the term refugee is really it's a political definition. I mean, it comes from the organization that I work with. So first I have to go by the legal definition of a refugee, and that's AALV works with people who have been displaced from their homelands. I don't think that anyone would deny the importance of the and the truth of what you're explaining. But the farm itself works specifically with refugees who have come here from other countries, and immigrants due to political persecution from other countries. That's not to say that there aren't opportunities to build coalitions, relationships. The farm's always there and it's always open, and I'm sure anyone would welcome anybody that's on this panel and anyone's listening to come down and walk around and visit. And there's some okra, there's some collard greens, and but there's lots of other things. There's I work with people also from Bhutan and Burma, and so we work with lots of different diverse groups of people, and I think that's part of the next phase of this farm is to really connect with other people throughout Vermont and have the farmers help to start making introductions beyond just the specific New Farms for New Americans farm itself. And that's the work of the next 3 years. That's what we're going to be shifting towards, is connecting farmers with all different people, and getting them more involved, hopefully, in having their voices heard, and also just and sharing their own experience as well, because I think that that's an important piece. And Liv mentioned passing the mic, and I think it's time for like the farmers to also be able to be celebrating their voices in Vermont. So in conjunction with all the other people that I work with at AALV, that's sort of where our next work is headed.
Yeah. It would definitely be interesting, like, not just like in terms of like New Farms for New Americans, but just like on a broader cultural front, like if we were to expand our definition of what it means to be a refugee, and just recognize specifically how like African Americans are long-standing refugees. We came to this country as refugees, I would argue, and we continue to be displaced, whether that's via the Great Migration and Jim Crow, or if that's through environmental racism and the new wave of colonialism, which I consider gentrification, and the ways in which African Americans specifically continue to be displaced from land and like live in food apartheid and have no access to grocery stores or fresh produce or just land to grow food or to like exercise on or just to venture on, would be interesting. And I would love to see some sort of partnership or collaboration that kind of honors that history and takes that into account, and that like there are plenty of African Americans in Vermont that also like need access to land and should have access to land, especially in terms of farming and, having the agency to grow their own food and to redevelop a relationship with farming that isn't rooted in enslavement. And I know that's not necessarily a question that you can answer, but it's just something that's like always on my mind, and I wanted to put it out there.
Those are like the questions that that we want these series to get to. And Zamora, thank you for bringing that up. And that is so beautiful about bringing all these women and femmes together, is like we can start asking these questions. Like maybe that is one of the right questions that Kat was mentioning before. And then like spark these collaborations of how to discuss and talk about in the future. And we're getting quickly to the end of our hour and 15 minutes. I'd love to pose one question that just came in from the audience kind of before we tie it all up. Maybe Sara or Emma, we haven't heard from you in a while. Can you discuss specific tactics your organizations use to ensure your grassroots voices and visions are guiding their strategies? Do either of you feel like speaking to that question, or anyone else can hop in? I think I see Emma, you raising.
I just also want to give Sara a chance to answer because I answered the last one. So go for it.
Sure. So, wait, can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, sure. Can you discuss specific tactics your organizations use to ensure your grassroots voices and visions are guiding your strategies?
Yeah, and I think this kind of touches on sort of my explanation of slow food in the beginning of how all of the campaigns and events and things like that we do are very adaptable to local communities. and so, like, for instance, one of our biggest campaigns of World Disco Soup Day, which is an event to fight food waste. This looks very different in one city to another. In Vermont, what we do is glean from local farms thousands of produce at the end of the growing season from coolers. We prepare these foods and then donate it to the local food shelf. And we have done this through like partnerships with other organizations, and have made it work in a way that that you know, others in the community find are valuable to them, rather than sort of just like coming in with guns blazing of like, this is how we're going to put on this event. And so I think collaboration is key with grassroots organizing, especially, and not kind of just like putting yourself in this bubble of like, especially through food systems work, because the food system is so dynamic that you need to have these partnerships with like-minded organizations to continue your mission further. And then additionally within the organization itself, having open forums for discussion from both memberships, members at large and board members. And I think one of the key pieces that I've been specifically trying to do at Slow Food Vermont is, which is a challenge, I'll call it out, but like creating a more horizontal power structure, and not just having this more like authoritative, like top down approach of like, oh, I'm board chair and what I say goes, like gathering input from the other members and participants to make it more of this sort of collective action, to make people who are doing that work, make them feel like it's their own, because it is. And that's how you get people to continue to stay interested and impassioned with that work. So I hope that answers the question, kind of.
Definitely. Did anyone want to respond to Sara Jean or anything for last moment? Kat?
I'll just quickly say sociocracy is one specific way that many of my organizations are learning to work differently together, more horizontally, like SJ, I like that, was saying, yeah, sociocracy, it's a pretty good tool. We're learning.
Thank you. I'm muted. Thank you. That hour flew by. I really want to thank all of you that spoke here today. I feel like this conversation could have gone on for so long and also include so many more voices. And so I hope this like initial conversation between the 7-8 of us will lead to more. And I'm really excited to continue to work with all of you. Zamora, if you want to maybe start sharing those last couple slides. To the audience, like grassroots organizing is all about involving our community and getting involved in our community. Our speakers today represent organizations with tons of opportunities to get involved, to volunteer, help in hands-on way. All of these projects are part of Vermont's resilient, just, and compassionate food system. And as we continue to work to make it more resilient, just, and compassionate, please consider how you can support this work. Websites are up on the screen. Visit them. If you have access to money, consider donating and contributing. Thank you all for watching and joining us today. This was recorded. It's available on our Facebook page, which is Shift Meals, and our website, which is shiftmeals.org. Share it, watch it again. I'm going to watch it again. And next week, for week 4, we're talking about Vermont's new wave of agriculture and women in the hemp and cannabis industry in Vermont. So that is going to be super exciting. Thank you all again so much. It's been a pleasure. All right, thank you.